Well, it's a long story, and I'll make it short. I, was brought up in a musical family, and my father was a dance band musician, loved jazz, and was very open-minded about music, and I grew up in that atmosphere. My father was a saxophone player and a clarinetist, and what I really wanted to do was to do that, but I couldn't do it. I couldn't get a sound. His second instrument was a guitar, which had fallen out of popularity in dance bands by the 50s. And he suggested I try that. And he taught me a few things and a few chords, and that's how I began on the guitar, long before it became popular as a symbol of a revolution. The early days were a kind of a struggle of transition, really, to find image. We were a band born of other bands, really. We were a band like so many bands, like a high school band. I started with playing with John when I was very young, and I was still young when I started to work with Roger's band, and we used to play pubs and bars and clubs and weddings and parties and things like that, and we just used to copy other bands. So the High Numbers was really about developing an image, and we were, which was something that happened around the late 50s, early 60s. I think it grew out of, the iconization of the face, James Dean, Marilyn Monroe, and to some extent the pop stars of the day, although I don't think it was so much the pop stars as the Hollywood stars that created this image building thing which pop people responded to. And in the 60s what happened is that we realised that we could create and control images. So with the help of a guy called Peter Meaden, who was an English press agent, we developed this image which was in tune then with what was a growing, strangely enough, a growing modern jazz movement which related to a dress style that you used to see French kids wearing on the left bank in Paris, which was called modernism at the time, as it applied, because it related to modern jazz. And we adopted that style of dressing. And the High Numbers was a transmutation of some street talk. They used to call each other Numbers and Tickets and Faces. And Numbers were the average guys, so High Numbers were a bit above average. And I always thought it was very cheeky for the Small Faces to call themselves the Small Faces. It was kind of like an aberration of High Numbers. Because the faces, the idea of a face in mod days was that was somebody that you really couldn't demystify. The faces were people that you never knew their names, you never knew who they were or where they came from or where they went to at the end of an evening. They just appeared at clubs and then disappeared, And it was around that kind of atmosphere that, around 61, 62, 63, that's when that came. The music scene was just bizarre. It was completely bizarre. I suppose it was very much the same as the States, Although looking back at that period, 58, 59, 60 in the States, there were some, I think, considerable figures around at the time. Although you kind of heard of, you discovered them in later on and realised that they'd been there all the time. But even in the charts, there were people that were good writers, Neil Sedaka, Paul Anka, and people like that, that were around. And people with good bands, like Ricky Nelson and whose guitar player, Jimmy Burton, was an absolute groundbreaker as a player, and is still out there, I think, doing it. All the obvious names that we're familiar with now. But in Britain, we had Cliff Richard. That was it. We had Cliff Richard. So what we did is that, we copied Cliff Richard's band, who were called The Shadows, and were, in their earliest incarnation, were pretty cool guys. But pretended that Cliff Richard wasn't in the group. And it meant that you had all these cool guitar bands, but who had these kind of, ice cream copies of Cliff Richard stuck on the front, and it would be this dickhead that all the girls would look at, So, we had to find some way of disposing of the ice cream man in the front and making sure that they looked at the right people, which were the guitar players and the drummers, and that's really where I think that three guitar, or sorry, that kind of simplified lineup, or everybody standing with a guitar, classically in the Beatles, where you see everybody playing the guitar. I suppose it's to make sure that although John, George and Paul were absolutely adorable, in the Cliff Richard mould, they were working, they were doing something, and they were writing, they were considerable people. So they elevated the whole industry a huge amount by doing that. They really refreshed, but also dignified. They refreshed in the traditional pop thing. They came along and they really excited everybody, but there was also tremendous dignifying going on. They allowed people who were in pop bands to feel that they were more than just, pop stars in the tradition of the cutout figures of the 50s, who were very much just teen idols, and it meant that a band like the Who could happen. It meant that I could be a pop star, because what it meant is that you didn't need people who had the kind of Latin good looks that had been a requirement up to that point. It actually attended to a fact that that hit me when I went to art school. I'd been through the whole of high school wondering how the fuck I was ever going to get laid as long as I live. And went to art school and realised that women had brains and had personalities, and also had a completely different process of evaluating men's sexuality. It was a complete, I believed the pop myth, and that was a revelation to me. And I think that, I think it's not. It's obvious that that the art school element in the Beatles was also important, and maybe this film Backbeat, which I think examines the early years. I think the Beatles writing about love and romance definitely had. I hated the fact that they wrote love songs all the time, but even that somehow it was a slightly higher level. It seemed to be writing about you could almost visualize real women, real people. It wasn't icons singing about vague romance anymore. It was the possibility of people singing about people. It had occasionally happened in the previous era. Peggy Lee had actually tried to write about real people and real emotions, but only by putting herself in the picture. And a couple of other people had done it, I think. Somebody that's more of a musicologist of that era would come up with them. But the Beatles started to dignify that thing. So they were incredibly important. Well, I think because I saw the Stones before I saw the Beatles, the first time I saw the Beatles play live was when the Who actually supported them on a tour. Well, I actually first saw the Stones that way too, but I saw the Stones first. I was just blown away by them. I think blown away by everything about the band, by how wild they looked, but how friendly they were. And by how kind of erotically charged everything around them was. Not so much, it was really between Jagger and Brian Jones at the time. Brian Jones was very beautiful looking for the time, and Jagger was just kind of this kind of gawky, body really, and they used to fight one another for the attention of the audience, and I suppose it was my male response to that eroticism that actually surprised me. It wasn't me looking at a bunch of screaming girls. It was, thinking, how the fuck do they do it? It was, which was definitely what I used to think when I'd go and see somebody like, Screaming Lord Sutch or Johnny Kidd and the Pirates. I used to think, why are these 14-year-old mod girls screaming at this 56-year-old man, who, to be honest, isn't going to be able to get it up anyway. you know, I didn't realise that it was just because girls like to scream. Anyway, that I started to kind of get into that loop, and I was seeing a girl at art school at the time who was just crazy about Charlie Watts, you know, and I used to look at him and kind of say, well, you know, it's funny looking, you know. He's not, you know, in terms of, you know, that whole thing of my preconception of the way people had to look, you know, if this beautiful girl is going to, I don't know what the fuck she was doing with me. I didn't make that judgment. I was judging the fact that she liked Charlie Watts. But and she just said, but Pete, he's the most beautiful man on earth. You know, and I'd kind of look and go, so values changed. You know, what we were taught male appearance should be about was changing under me, around me. And the Stones were very much a part of that. They were in my neighbourhood. You see, it was different than with the Beatles. They'd come from Liverpool and come down, and so it was different. And I was very much involved in it, and I saw them a lot. And you know, they used to play the Ealing Club, which was, you know, I was at Ealing Art School. You know, I used to see them coming off the train and going to the show with their guitars and stuff. So, and we were listening to exactly the same music, exactly the same blues records. I mean, precisely the same. So, you know, the empathy was complete. And but the difference between the two bands was not as much as I think, looking back, as I think I thought at the time. I think that both bands, I've tended to kind of pull bands apart, and I think that we all have really, but they were very, very close together. Their function was, you know, to destabilise the rock industry. The only two bands at the time, really, that I think that were really important were the Animals and the Kinks. The Animals, because a lot of people forget how early they got into America. They were the second band to follow the Beatles in, and they were huge. And I think it really did adversely affect them, you know, because they were a really good, solid R&B band. And I think, you know, the pressure that was on them was just huge. I don't think Eric's recovered. But the Kinks were much more quintessentially English. You know, I always think that Ray Davies should one day be poet laureate. You know, he invented a new kind of poetry and a new kind of language for pop writing, which I think, you know, influenced me from the very, very, very beginning. Very strange that I should be so directly influenced, because it was from Sideways. You know, we were moving forward together, but I was very influenced by him. And I think that Dave Davis is also very underestimated. You know, when we started, I used to feel that, well, it's obvious that, you know, that Dave couldn't have done the kind of innovation that I did, because, you know, I was with Jim Marshall building the bloody amplifiers, you know. I remember the idea that what Jim Marshall was getting excited about was that, you know, he hated his father, I think, and his father was from the dance band era, and he had been a drummer and had failed because he had something wrong with his legs, and that when I was going in and saying I want them bigger and louder, you know, we want to kill the fucking audience, we want to shut them up, we want to, you know, none of this, you know, we don't want these fucking geeks coming up and giving us fucking requests, you know. And, you know, if you don't play the #1 record for my girlfriend's birthday, I'll kill you afterwards, kind of thing. It would just be turn up there and kind of wham, fuck off. And that this little guy used to get really, his eyes used to go and go, I'll do it. Bigger, you want them bigger and louder. And he did it. He built these huge bloody amplifiers, you know, just impossibly large, and somehow the Kinks adopted some of that as well. They didn't actually use the Marshall size amps that we use, but they were loud, they were raucous, the guitar sound was similar, there was feedback there. All of those things were happening at the same time, but Ray, and still to this day, there's a continuum to his writing, and he started writing and he's been very, very faithful to it, very, very pure. And I don't think there's a single song that he's written that I don't like. And other Kinks fans, that, you know, other people that I know, you know, that are as kind of rabid as Kinks fan as I am, are exactly the same. You know, you either love all of everything that Ray does, or very little of it, you know. And he's an extraordinary writer. He's a poet, I think, a tremendously powerful poet. Well, I think Waterloo Sunset might have grown. It's difficult to get the context. It's difficult to know whether a song like Waterloo Sunset, I'd have to look in the book, Waterloo Sunset influenced Strawberry Fields, or vice versa. But I remember Eric Clapton and me being summoned to Brian Epstein's house to listen to Strawberry Fields and Penny Lane, and we heard it, and I remember thinking, you know, God, what was that? And I remember Eric came up with a great idea, and he said, could I hear it again, please? And I remember being stunned at that. It was like kind of Oliver asking for more. You know, I thought, God, he's so courageous asking to hear it again. And then we heard it again. And I thought like most records, it would start to thin out, you know. But what actually happened was what happened with so many of the Beatles records of that period. You heard more. And to this day, I mean, it seems bizarre to say so, but to this day, when I listen to Sgt. Pepper, I hear it and I think, you know, I must have heard this record 1,000 times, you know, in studied listening sessions, and it feels as though I've never heard it before. There are some records like that. And I think it's because what actually happens is that you hear the music and you don't relate the music to the condition that you're in or the place that you're in when you first hear it. Although the moment that I heard Strawberry Fields for the first time was very significant to me. It was the first time I'd been at a dinner table with all of the Beatles. It was a great honour to be asked to come and hear it for the first time. Eric and I were the first two people to hear it, other than the band. And yet, when I hear it, it doesn't connect to that place. It lives on its own. Well, I think to get a real sense of the context of Bob Dylan's, you have to remember that the folk tradition was one that in the UK, like the USA, already had a kind of a really quite dreary structure around it. You know, a lot of junkies. A lot of people that were politically radical but physically incapable. And what Dylan actually did, it seemed to me, was not to create not necessarily to create a new political movement, or to save folk from what was actually happening to it. You know, that in this country we had people like Ewan McCall, and in America you had Seeger and others who were, you know, brilliant, perceptive, radical, life-changing people. And, you know, Joan Baez has never stopped. You know, she's always been there. That what Dylan did was actually take that music and that process of writing, which is that, you know, if you want to, you can write about a march from here to here. If you want to, you can write about the fact that Joe Blow shouldn't have been sent to jail for what he was sent to jail for. You can write a song about anything. He took that folk tradition and brought it into pop. And for a while it was very, very confusing. I used to listen to A Hard Rain's Gonna Fall and wonder what it was about. I loved it, but I wondered what it was about, you know. I listened to Blowing in the Wind and I wondered what it was about. You know, I hadn't learnt the trick of listening to the obvious, you know, and that there would only ever be one stage of metaphor. And his impact was also musical. His guitar playing, his melody writing, the sound of his voice, the style of his singing were all wonderful, I think, just absolutely wonderful. I just loved loved listening to him and used to listen to him all the time, often listening to songs that I didn't understand, but just because I loved to listen to him. And it didn't occur to me that the Beatles would be listening to him as well. You know, I was at art school, so some folk guy had given me the first Bob Dylan record, and immediately told me to stop listening when he appeared at Albert Hall with an electric guitar. But you know what I mean? It was that kind of... There were always people there training you. There were jazz guys that told you what Charlie Parker records to listen to, and there would be a classical guy telling you what, new writer you had to listen to. And the folk guys were the same. Dylan, when he first appeared, was a good, kosher folk performer. But he made the transfer immediately into rock and revolutionised it. And I think that I Can't Explain was a post-Dylan song. I'd already heard Bob Dylan and bathed in Bob Dylan before I wrote the first hit for The Who. You know, I've been influenced by Bob Dylan since before the beginning, and long before I knew how I was being influenced. What Jimmy was doing was sublimely... it was an epiphany in the actual dictionary definition of the word. You felt pained because in his presence and in the presence of that music, you felt small and you realised how far you had to go. What was also painful was to meet him afterwards and realise that he didn't know what he was doing. And he didn't know that he had no idea of his greatness. So there was also that, the feeling that, that one knew, I knew that he was going to burn out very, very quickly. He was so kind of insecure and shy, sweet guy, really nice guy. The coin toss actually has some kind of meaning after that kind of eulogy to Jimmy, because that's the way I feel about him and that's the way I felt about him, and I couldn't deal with the idea that at this critical concert we might go on after him. In other words, he would be down the bill to The Who. I felt he had to be up the bill. He had to be higher on the bill than The Who. And he said to me, from his insecurity, that's not what you really mean. What you really mean is you don't want me to go on first. You want to be first up there with the guitar smashing. So I said, Jimmy, I swear to you that's not what it's about. And Brian Jones was standing with me, and Jimmy started to play. He stood on a chair in front of me and he started to play this incredible guitar. And it goes down in history as a jam session. I've heard Roger talk about it as a jam session, but there wasn't a jam session. It was just Jimmy on a chair playing at me like that. Don't fuck with me, you little shit. And then he snapped out of it and he put the guitar down and he said, okay, let's toss a coin. So we tossed a coin and we got to go on first. He then went on immediately after us, I think. I don't think there was anybody in between. So I went out to sit with Mama Cass to watch Jimmy. And as he started doing the stuff with his guitar, she turned around to me, she said to me, he's stealing your act. And I said, no, he's not stealing my act. He's doing my act. and I think that was the thing. For me it was an act and for him it was something else. It was an extension of what he was doing. I think of him as a songwriter. I think of him as a songwriter who rediscovered the ballad, I think, in rock and roll, in the English group. Bowie is somebody who came backstage at the Albert Hall and announced to me that he was going to continue where I left off with Tommy. He came and told me. My little brother Simon was there. He was 8. He remembers the conversation. He came back and he said, we'd played Tommy. It was the day that the Stones played in the Park. We played a show with Chuck Berry called the Pop Proms. It was at the Albert Hall, the first rock and roll that I had at the Proms. We played Tommy, and Bowie was in the front row, standing next to my little brother, and who didn't know who he was then, because he wasn't anybody. He was a guy called David Jones, who we shared a publisher at the time. And he came back and he said, that's what I'm going to do. He said, I've now seen that I can create characters you know, and went away and started to do it. So I think it's just very much about, you know, building blocks, you know, like things happening. And I don't think of what Bowie did as excess. I don't think of what Elton wears as excess, or, you know, the excesses were to do with numbers rather than ideas. I think, you know, I think that you have to. You could say, for example, that the laser beams that the Who carried in the mid-70s were an example of that excess, until you actually saw them and realised what a simple lighting effect it was. It's just a ray of light which you could do certain things with. The fact that it required something like 4,000 gallons of water a minute to cool them off, and you had to find that supply somewhere, and that water and electricity don't mix very well and all that, was another story. That was a backstage excess, you know, and we used to live with it. And it was very, very expensive. These were sort of industrial, military quality lasers that used to cost $10,000 a piece. And airlines used to seem to like throwing them out of the airline. But those excesses are again, I think they're about, you know, an advancement of the form, you know, an advancement of the show business side of the thing. I don't think that. I can't really comment on George Clinton. I'm not even sure that I know who he is. So, I mean, I do know who he is, but you know what I mean? I don't know. I know that he's very, very significant, but I've never kind of engaged it properly. The Beach Boys, to begin with, are kind of a rather impudent influence, because Keith Moon, who was our drummer, was a crazy surf music fan. So we got all the, you know, we got everything. We got, you know, we got Jan and Dean and lots of other low class surf acts as well as the Beach Boys. But you know, from Pet Sounds onwards, the Beach Boys were hugely important, demonstrating what you could do in a studio and what you couldn't do in a studio, and opening up the. And Motown had already done that to some extent. You know, Motown had actually. They'd shown that black pop dance music, R&B dance music, could just be, you know, extraordinarily beautiful to listen to, and beautifully produced and elegant, and it was very, very big influence. I never got to write in that style very much, because Keith Moon didn't like to swing. You know, if you know, my generation actually started with a backbeat, you know, and Keith didn't want to do it that way, and seemed like it wasn't the right way to do it, and it ended up, you know, like that, very, very on. But Tamla always had that kind of swing to it, you know, and swing says nothing matters, you know. Nothing matters, you know. Whatever we're singing about, it doesn't matter. Whereas our music was urgency, urgency, urgency. Everything matters, you know. Very, very kind of. We are Europeans, you know. We are serious. Everything matters. Everything must be dealt with. And something about that kind of. Somewhere between, you know, the kind of laconic, slightly intellectual space cadet thing that the Beach Boys were doing very, very early on, you know, before Sgt. Pepper, Pet Sounds appeared. Sound experimentation, studio experimentation, the Sunshine Life, you know, and what was happening with Tamla Motown. I think something, again, we in Europe managed to benefit from being sufficiently objective to be able to see what was really happening. You know, that there was something really important happening, which was that this great music that we've discovered, this great music which is still growing, this music which now you can write songs about what's really happening deep, deep, deep inside of you and what's happening around you in the world, can also sound extraordinary. You know, there's no reason why it shouldn't sound as good as Mozart or Beethoven or you know, a great Ellington gig. Do you know what I mean? We started to believe, hey, this doesn't have to sound like shit. It doesn't actually have to sound like chainsaws. It can sound beautiful, and the message can still come across. And I think that was something that I learned from Tamla and Pet Sounds. I really liked them at the time. I really did. I liked their music at the time. Steve Stills is doesn't help Steve Stills when anybody says this, unfortunately, but Steve Stills is one of the great geniuses of the guitar, of every style of guitar. Problem is that he's never really had much of an idea of how to deal with that and deal with the fact that not everybody in the world has recognised that. Probably somebody else that suffered from the fact that you know, the presence of somebody like Jimi Hendrix maybe took some of his thunder, because he was not just a great guitar player but also a great performer. But their vocal style was it was groundbreaking in a way because it was arranged. You know, Stephen could write charts, you know, and I'm not sure that everybody in the band could read charts, but he could write them, so he could organise in a traditional way. And so it's, you know, the harmonic structure of Crosby, Stills and Nash was new and unique and very personal to. I think he controlled it. You know, one tends to think that it's about Crosby and Graham's voice, but you know, for me, the halcyon years of Crosby, Stills and Nash is when they imported a human being, a real human being, called Neil Young. And once Neil Young was in the band, wow, that was some band. That was a great couple of records they made. And Neil Young is still out there. Neil Young's the only one left, really. Neil Young is the only man left who still is out there, his beard growing, on MTV Unplugged, and he believes, you know. I've got passion when I'm on the stage, but I don't know that I really believe, you know, the way he believes. But, yeah, they were a good band. To lump three extraordinary artists like the Sex Pistols, the Clash, and Elvis Costello under the banner of punk is really an indication of how categories fail, you know, miserably, to attend to what was actually happening at the time was you know, the need for another tidal wave, you know, and I suppose everybody wanted one band to do it like it happened with the Beatles. And it turned out not to be one band, but a lot of bands, a lot of journalists, a lot of young record people who went into the record companies and changed them. And therefore it's had a lasting effect. You know, since punk, rock journalism hasn't been the same in the UK. A lot of the people that began as punk journalists have now got jobs in big national newspapers. So, you know, they've had a real lasting effect. The Sex Pistols were obviously the most significant because they were the first, and because McLaren was organising them and allowing their anarchy to he gave them the space, space in which to be anarchic. But also, I think because, you know, Paul Cook and Steve Jones in the band are great rock and roll players. You know, they said they couldn't play, but they actually could play very, very well. And that John Lydon is a fucking star. You know, he's a star. You know, he's just one of the world's stars. You know, you see him and you know he is going to be famous. The Clash are different because the Clash were a kind of a boys' band, like, you know, to some extent like the Who were in the very early days. A gang band, you know, kind of a fellowship band. They gathered together people and they kind of went around following them around. And I suppose Costello was the brains in charge of the whole thing. I don't know, but you know, that's a summing up of what happened. It was very, very, very exciting, challenging, and there was a hell of a lot of pain there for Pete, I must say, as usual, because, you know, I'd kind of welcomed it, you know, and challenged it and wanted it to happen. And then I'd realised that the person that they wanted to shoot was me. I was kind of in the gang kind of going, yeah, come on, let's get them. That's it. Let's show them. Let's show those fucking jaded people, you know. And then they're all kind of looking at me, no, you don't understand. It's you we're going to kill. So then I realised that, you know, that they liked me really, so I was okay. There's kind of a moment there. I really was kind of surprised. You know, I obviously live in a very shallow puddle, but never mind. Well, it's a fan story, really. The first time that I saw the Stones play, we were behind the curtain at the St Mary's Ballroom in Putney, and we'd warmed the audience up. The Stones were about to go on, and Keith Richard was limbering up. He was kind of getting down on his knees and getting his blood going. And one of the things that he did is he went like that with one arm and like that with the other arm. And as he was doing that with the other arm, the curtain opened. And he continued to do it as the curtain opened. And they were playing Come On, which was their hit at the time. And he went, yang, yang, yang. 1, 2, 3, 4. So for about a year, I thought I was just copying my hero, you know. Literally just copying him. You know, in fact, most of the clubs that we played at the time, the audience had been at that show and they knew I was copying my hero. They used to come up and say, when are you going to stop doing that Keith Richard thing? Anyway, I then saw the Stones 2 or 3 times more and Keith wasn't doing it. And I went up to him and I said to him something like, do you mind that I copied, you know, your arm swinging technique? And he looked at me like I was a germ. And I realised that he didn't remember doing it. So I kept it in my act. It was very much an act, but it did actually, in the end, become a part of a guitar style which produced a sound that was unique. It produces a sound which you can't get any other way. It's kind of you hit the strings so hard and so quickly and with such force that it sets them vibrating and intermodulating. It's a bit technical, but it does actually create a brilliant shanging kind of metallic sound. And I have obviously hurt myself hundreds of times. I haven't counted the stitches in my hands, but you know they are numerous. Maybe hundreds. The best one was at Madison Square Garden when they'd had an ice hockey game in the afternoon, and the medic was still there, and I slashed my hand on the pick guard or something, a big open wound. And I went back and he went ding, 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 with a kind of staple gun and said, back out there, like I was an ice hockey player. And it was the best wound that I've ever had for healing. But yeah, I've cut myself and I've often thought that maybe I've got something against this right hand of mine. I don't quite know what it is, but you know, it's suffered greatly. I had a definition once, and I'll just repeat that. I said it's like a fire, and it burns and it burns and it burns and it burns, and that sounds like a sort of kind of a romantic fire idea until you realise that what's keeping the fire alight is bodies, and that. So in a sense, it's about people who are sacrificing themselves in a way because of a belief in this great music that they believe from in hearing it and growing up with it. They've felt something which has obviously changed them inside, and they want to see that change happen to other people too. And I think it's a mistake to throw yourself on the fire, because I think it is the individual that changes and not the world at large. But I think we're trying to turn it into. I think maybe even Billy Joel turned this idea into a song. But that's how what I think it is. There's always if I walk away from it and say, oh, let it go out, somebody's going to look at me and say, are you kidding? I'll jump on. I'll keep it alive. There'll be a Kurt Cobain or an Eddie Vedder or Ice-T, or there'll be some new people willing to throw themselves on and see what happens.